Cop Harasses the rock at airport. Seconds later, his career is over. The phone slipped from Dwayne Johnson's trembling hand, clattering against the hardwood floor of his Boston apartment. On the other end of the now disconnected call, 15 years of carefully constructed lies had just imploded. He stood frozen, his reflection fractured across the shattered screen, a perfect metaphor for his life in this moment. "They found it," he whispered to the empty room. Outside his window, snow was falling, the first of the season. It would have been beautiful if his world wasn't collapsing. 3 floors below, traffic moved steadily along Commonwealth Avenue, pedestrians huddled in winter coats, utterly unaware that Dwayne Johnson's carefully constructed life had just been excavated from beneath him. The Lake Havasu Police Department had called about a car recently discovered in the murky depths of the Colorado River. A 1998 Chevy Malibu navy blue, reported missing 15 years ago, the same night his best friend Ellie had disappeared. "We found something else too, Mr. Johnson," the detective had said, his voice maddeningly professional. "We'd like you to come in and answer some questions." Dwayne's lungs constricted as memories flooded back. That sweltering Arizona night, the argument, tires squealing on asphalt, headlights sweeping across dark water. He'd spent 15 years trying to forget, building a career as a respected cybersecurity entrepreneur 3,000 miles away, dating women who looked nothing like Ryan, creating a new identity with clean edges and sharp corners that left no space for the messy past. He pulled his suitcase from the closet with mechanical precision. His fingers traced the business card the detective had emailed. Detective Marcus Reeves, Lake Havasu Police Department. The car contained evidence. Of what, he wouldn't say over the phone. But Dwayne knew. He had always known this day might come. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. Ryan. After all these years, his name still appeared occasionally, a ghost haunting his carefully curated contact list. "They called you too, didn't they? We need to talk before you fly out there." Dwayne stared at the message, bile rising in his throat. Ryan Blackwood, the third point in their fateful triangle. The boy Ellie had loved, the boy who had loved Dwayne instead. The catalyst for everything that happened that night. He booked the next flight to Phoenix without responding to his message. Whatever was waiting in Lake Havasu, truth, justice, punishment, he would face it alone, just as he had carried the weight of that night alone for 15 years. As Nora methodically packed her suitcase, her hands moved with calm efficiency that belied the storm inside her. The truth was finally surfacing, like that car rising from the murky depths, and she wasn't sure if she was more afraid of what they had found or what they hadn't. Ellie Chen had been everything Nora was not, effortlessly beautiful, wildly spontaneous, magnetic in a way that drew people into her orbit. The girls had been inseparable since 7th grade, when Nora's family moved to Lake Havasu City, Arizona, a sun-bleached tourist town known for its transplanted London Bridge and raucous spring break parties. Nora had been the awkward new girl, with frizzy hair and a Boston accent, clutching her sketchbook like a shield. Ellie had simply appeared beside her in the cafeteria, slid half her chocolate pudding across the table, and declared, "You're sitting with me from now on." Just like that, Nora belonged somewhere. By senior year, they were still inseparable, though they'd grown into completely different people. Ellie was the life of every party, while Nora stayed on the periphery, observing, sketching building designs in her notebook. Ellie dated a string of forgettable boys before settling on Ryan Blackwood, the brooding son of a real estate developer, who had more money than most in their working-class town. "He's different," Ellie had insisted when Nora questioned the relationship. "He sees things in the world that other people miss." What Ellie didn't see was how Ryan looked at Nora when Ellie wasn't watching, with a quiet intensity that made her uncomfortable. Or how over time, those looks had begun to feel like a lifeline to Nora, who had never been anyone's first choice. What began as innocent study sessions, Ryan needed help with calculus while Ellie was at dance practice, evolved into something dangerous and electric. Conversations that stretched late into the night, his hand accidentally brushing hers. The gradual realization that Ryan understood Nora's passion for architecture, her dreams of designing buildings that would outlast her, in a way Ellie never could. "You're the one who should be getting out of this town," he told her once. "You have real talent." These were the words Nora had been starving to hear, validation that her obsessive sketching might actually lead somewhere. That summer after graduation, with college looming on the horizon, something shifted. The betrayal happened in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. A text message here, a lingering glance there, until the night. Nora and Ryan crossed a line they could never uncross. The guilt was immediate and suffocating. Nora had sworn to tell Ellie everything, to beg for forgiveness, while Ryan insisted they needed to be more careful with the truth. It would destroy her, he'd argued. And for what? A mistake we won't make again. But Ellie had already suspected. The confrontation happened at the edge of the lake, during an end-of-summer bonfire with their classmates celebrating one last weekend before they all scattered to different colleges. Ellie had consumed too many wine coolers, her words slurring, into accusations that cut too close to the truth. "You think I don't see how you look at him?" she'd screamed at Nora, loud enough for others to hear. My boyfriend, Nora!" Nora had tried to calm her down to get her away from the crowd, but Ellie was beyond reason. She grabbed her car keys and stormed off, ignoring the calls from friends not to drive. Nora had followed, frantic, jumping into the passenger seat, just as Ellie peeled away from the beach. What happened next lived in Nora's nightmares. The screaming match, the curve in the road, Ellie's hands leaving the wheel as she turned to shove Nora, the horrifying sensation of tires leaving pavement, the terrible silence before impact, the cold rush of water. Nora remembered swimming through the sinking car, reaching for Ellie's unconscious form, her fingers grazing fabric before the current pulled them apart. She remembered breaking the surface alone, gasping and screaming Ellie's name as the murky waters of the Colorado River swallowed the car whole. Ryan had arrived, minutes later having followed in his truck. He'd dragged Nora from the water as she fought him, trying to dive back in. It was too late, he'd said, too dangerous in the dark. They needed to call for help. Except they didn't. Ryan, with a calculating precision that sometimes still chilled. Nora had convinced her of a different story. An awful, unforgivable story where Ellie had driven off alone, distraught over a fight about college plans. Where Nora and Ryan had been back at the bonfire with dozens of witnesses. Where they had no idea what had happened until Ellie and her car were reported missing the next day. The search had lasted weeks. Ellie's parents, immigrant restaurateurs who had sacrificed everything to give their daughter opportunities, had looked Nora in the eye and begged for any information. Nora had held their hands and cried with them, her lies burning like acid in her throat. By the time fall semester started, Nora had fled to Boston for college, leaving Ryan and the investigation behind. She never returned to Lake Havasu, not even when her parents moved away years later. The town existed only in her nightmares, along with Ellie's face disappearing beneath dark water. The Phoenix airport was a blur of noise and color as Nora navigated toward the rental car counters. She'd managed to avoid Ryan, taking an earlier flight than the one she'd mentioned in her terse reply to his message. She needed to face this on her own terms. Her phone buzzed again as she slid into the driver's seat of her rental. Another text from Ryan. "I'm already in Lake Havasu. Meet me at Bridgewater Channel at sunset, please, Nora, before you talk to the police." 15 years had done little to change the scorching heat of an Arizona October. As Nora drove the familiar highway toward Lake Havasu City, sweat beaded along her hairline despite the air conditioning. The landscape was exactly as she remembered. Craggy, mountains rising from barren desert, cacti standing like sentinels along the roadside. The sameness of it all was disorienting, as if the land had been frozen in time while she'd spent years evolving into someone else. She checked into a roadside motel under her name, not bothering with pretense. The police already knew she was coming. Her meeting with Detective Reeves wasn't until tomorrow morning, which left her with a decision about Ryan's request. Part of her wanted to ignore him completely, to maintain the boundaries she'd established by cutting him out of her life years ago. But another part, the part that still woke gasping from dreams of dark water, needed to know what he knew. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Nora found herself driving toward Bridgewater Channel, where the famous London Bridge spanned the water. She parked in the public lot and walked along the canal, past tourists taking photos and teenagers lounging on rented boats. Ryan was waiting where the walkway widened into a viewing platform. 15 years had weathered him, in ways Nora hadn't anticipated. The sharp edges of his youth had softened, his dark hair, now flecked with grey at the temples. He wore the uniform of a successful man, tailored slacks, expensive watch, but his eyes held the same intensity that had once made her feel special, then, later, complicit. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I shouldn't have," Nora replied, keeping several feet between them. "What do you want, Ryan?" "To protect you." His voice was low, urgent. "They found more than just the car, Nora. They found her." The world tilted beneath Nora's feet. 15 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope that somehow, impossibly, Ellie had survived. That she'd swum to a different shore, started a new life somewhere for reasons Nora couldn't fathom. The fragile fantasy collapsed. "I need to sit down," she managed, moving to a nearby bench. Ryan sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. The car was wedged in a crevice underwater. When they raised it, they found remains. "They're doing DNA testing, but—" "It's her," Nora said flatly. "We both know it's her." Ryan nodded, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made Nora's chest ache. They'll have questions about that night, about why she was driving alone, upset, about the alcohol in her system. "You want to make sure our stories still match," Nora said, the realization bitter on her tongue. "That's why you wanted to meet before I talked to the police." "I want to protect both of us," Ryan insisted. "We were kids, Nora. We made a terrible mistake, but we've built lives since then. Good lives. You're a successful architect. I run my father's development company. We employ hundreds of people. We do good things in the world." "Good things," Nora repeated, her voice hollow. "Is that how you justify it to yourself? By tallying up good deeds against the fact that we let her drown? That we lied to her parents, to the police? That we've been living our lives while she's been—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "We didn't cause the accident," Ryan said, his voice tight. "She was drunk. She took her hands off the wheel. What happened was tragic, but—" "Stop," Nora stood abruptly. "Just stop. I was there too, remember? I know exactly what happened, and so do you." The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the channel. Tourists were thinning out, heading to restaurants for dinner. In the distance, lights were coming on along the bridge, illuminating the structure that had been transplanted stone by stone from London to this desert oasis, a monument to the human capacity for audacious relocation. Nora had once found it fascinating. Now it just seemed absurd, like her attempts to rebuild her life 3,000 miles from where she'd shattered it. "What are you going to tell them?" Ryan asked, his voice smaller now. Nora looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in 15 years. She saw not just the successful businessman he'd become, but the frightened boy who had pulled her from the water that night, who had calculated the angles of their survival while Ellie sank into darkness, who had convinced her that silence was their only option. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. As she walked away, leaving Ryan silhouetted against the darkening water, Nora felt something shift inside her, like a foundation settling after years of instability. Tomorrow she would face Detective Reeves. She would see the evidence they had recovered from the lake. And then she would make a decision about the truth, the real truth, not the sanitized version she and Ryan had constructed to save themselves. For the first time in 15 years, Nora began to consider what it might mean to be free of secrets, even if that freedom came at the cost of everything she had built. Detective Marcus Reeves was younger than Nora had expected, probably in his mid-30s, with the lean build of a runner and observant eyes that missed nothing. His office at the Lake Havasu Police Department was Spartan, with case files neatly stacked on a desk, otherwise devoid of personal items. "Thank you for coming all this way, Ms. Walsh," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I understand. This must be difficult," Revisiting the disappearance of your friend after so many years? Nora nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Has the DNA confirmation come back yet? She asked, cutting to the question that had kept her awake all night. If Reeves was surprised by her directness, he didn't show it. Yes, it has. The remains found in the vehicle have been positively identified as Elena Chen. Despite having prepared herself for this confirmation, Nora felt the news like a physical blow. Ellie, not just missing, but definitively gone. Her best friend, whose laughter had once filled every corner of Nora's life, reduced to clinical terms like remains and positively identified. We've notified her parents, Reeves continued. They still live in San Francisco. They've requested that her remains be sent there for burial once the investigation is complete. Nora hadn't known the Chens had moved to San Francisco. She'd lost track of them years ago, unable to bear the weight of their grief on top of her own guilt. The realization that they had continued living, moving, existing without their daughter, while holding out hope for answers, made her stomach clench. The investigation? She repeated. I thought it was ruled an accident, a presumed drowning. Reeves leaned forward, elbows on his desk. That was the preliminary finding, yes. But the recovery of the vehicle has provided new evidence. He slid a photograph across the desk. Nora steeled herself before looking down at what she assumed would be the recovered car, rusted and grim from its years underwater. Instead, she found herself staring at a tarnished silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny silver paintbrush. Her gift to Ellie for her 18th birthday, an inside joke about Ellie's hopeless attempts at art. This was found in the vehicle, Reeves said, along with Ms. Chen's remains, but we also found something else. Fibers caught in the passenger side seatbelt. The lab confirmed they match a particular type of cotton blend popular in women's clothing around 2008. Nora's mouth went dry. What are you saying? I'm saying the physical evidence suggests Elena Chen wasn't alone in that car. When it went into the water, Reeves's voice remained professionally neutral, which contradicts witness statements from the time, including yours, Ms. Walsh. The room seemed to constrict around Nora, air thinning until each breath required conscious effort. This was the moment she had dreaded for 15 years, the reckoning she had both feared and, in her most honest moments, craved. I'd like to hear your recollection of that night, Reeves said. In your own words, not what you told the officers 15 years ago, but what you remember actually happening. Nora looked up at him, searching his face for judgment and finding only professional curiosity. Why now? She asked. Why reopen this after so long? The case was never closed, Ms. Walsh, just inactive until new evidence emerged. He paused. And sometimes time gives people perspective, makes them see things differently than they did when they were younger, makes them reconsider choices they made in moments of panic or fear. It was an invitation, not an accusation. A door being held open. Nora thought about Ryan, probably sitting in his hotel room waiting for her call, expecting confirmation that she had maintained their story. She thought about the Chens, finally able to bury their daughter, but still without the full truth of how she died. She thought about Ellie, whose last moments had been claimed by darkness and cold while Nora swam away. I was in the car, she said finally, the words emerging like stones she'd been carrying in her throat for years. I was with Ellie when it went into the water. Once she started, the truth poured out of her. The affair with Ryan, the confrontation at the bonfire, the argument in the car, the accident, her desperate attempts to save Ellie, and Ryan's calculated decision to create a different version of events. Reeves took notes as she spoke, his expression remaining neutral even as she confessed to years of deception. When she finally fell silent, emotionally spent, he placed his pen down carefully. What made you decide to tell the truth now? He asked quietly. Nora looked down at her hands, no longer trembling but steady. Because I've been drowning too, she said, just more slowly. Later, as she signed her statement, Nora asked, what happens now? That depends on the district attorney, Reeves replied. Leaving the scene of a fatal accident, obstruction of justice, these are serious charges. But given the circumstances, your age at the time, and your voluntary statement now, I can't make any promises, but cooperation counts for something." As Nora left the police station, the Arizona sun was high and unforgiving, bathing everything in harsh light that left no shadows for hiding. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Ryan. She deleted them without listening to his messages, then scrolled to a number she'd never used but had saved years ago, found through a Google search during a late night of particular guilt and grief. She pressed dial, her heart hammering as the line connected. "Hello?" The voice was older, accented, but unmistakably Mrs. Chen. "Mrs. Chen," Nora began, her voice catching. "This is Nora Walsh, Ellie's friend. I heard they found her, and I need to tell you something I should have told you 15 years ago." 6. Months later, Nora stood at the edge of Bridgewater Channel, watching tourists stream across the London Bridge. It was April now, the desert already warming towards summer. Behind her, the courthouse loomed, the place where, just hours earlier, she had received her sentence, 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and a permanent record that would likely end her career at the prestigious architectural firm where she'd been on track to make partner. Ryan had fared worse. His attempts to convince Nora to maintain their lie had included statements that, when revealed to the police, demonstrated premeditation in covering up the accident. The texts had been particularly damning. He was currently serving a 2-year sentence in a minimum security facility. Nora had resigned from her firm before they could fire her, packed up her Boston apartment, and moved temporarily to San Francisco. Not to flee this time, but to be near the Chens during the legal proceedings, to answer their questions, to face their anger and grief without flinching. Their forgiveness was not something she expected or felt she deserved. But in the rawness of truth, something unexpected had emerged. A fragile connection built on shared love for Ellie. Mrs. Chen had asked to see Nora's architectural drawings, remembering how Ellie had talked about her friend's talent. Mr. Chen had shown her photos of Ellie that Nora had never seen, filling in 15 years of imagined memories, with the stark reminder that Ellie would forever be 18, her potential crystallized in amber. "I thought you'd be headed back to Boston by now," a voice said behind her. Nora turned to find Detective Reeves out of uniform in jeans and a faded t-shirt, a coffee cup in his hand. "I gave up my apartment there," she said. "I'm not sure where I'm going next." Reeves nodded, coming to stand beside her at the railing. Below them, the water of the channel glittered in the late afternoon sun, deceptively peaceful. "The Chens mentioned you might be staying in California. For a while." "They've asked me to help design a memorial garden for Ellie," Nora said, still somewhat bewildered by the request. "At the community center where she used to volunteer. I'm not sure it's appropriate, given everything, but—" "It sounds like exactly what they need," Reeves interrupted gently, "and maybe what you need too." Nora looked at him, surprised by his insight. "It won't bring her back." "No," he agreed, "but it honors who she was. That matters." They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the sunlight dance. On the water, Nora thought about the architectural plans already taking shape in her mind. A garden with winding paths and hidden nooks, reflecting Ellie's love of exploration and secrets. A place where the Chens could feel close to their daughter, where the weight of absence might someday be balanced by the peace of remembrance. "You know," Reeves said finally, "I've been a detective for 12 years. Most people, when confronted with evidence that contradicts their story, just double down on the lie. They convince themselves it's too late for the truth to matter. But it always matters, doesn't it?" Nora asked, thinking of the Chens' faces when she'd finally told them everything. The pain, yes, but also the closing of a circle that had remained agonizingly open for 15 years. "Always," Reeves agreed. He hesitated, then added, "For what?" "It's worth I think you're going to be okay, Ms. Walsh. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually." As he walked away, leaving Nora alone with the water and the sky and the weight of all that had happened, she realized that for the first time since that night 15 years ago, She could imagine a future not defined by secrets. The road ahead was uncertain, her career in shambles, her reputation forever altered, her heart still heavy with grief and guilt that no court sentence could absolve. But she was no longer drowning. The truth, even with all its jagged edges and consequences, had finally allowed her to break the surface and breathe. Nora took one last look at the place where Ellie's car had been pulled from the depths 6 months earlier. Then she turned away from the water and headed back towards solid ground, each step a small act of faith in the possibility of redemption. Character count, 15,000 hours.